Close your eyes for just a moment and picture this. The golden light of a Roman sunset washing over weathered marble columns, their surfaces etched with symbols no one has fully deciphered in centuries. Beneath your feet, the same stones once trod by emperors and priests, now cracked with age, still pulse with stories waiting to be told. These aren't just ruins. They're time capsules, each fragment whispering clues about a world where gods walked among mortals, where politics and faith collided in spectacular ways, and where the fate of an empire was often decided not on battlefields, but in the quiet sanctuaries of temples now lost to time. What if I told you that some of Rome's most fascinating secrets aren't hidden in grand landmarks like the Colosseum or the Pantheon, but in the overlooked corners of forgotten temples? Places where the paint has faded, the altars have crumbled, but the echoes of ancient chants still seem to linger in the air. These sacred spaces were once the heartbeat of Roman life, sites of miracles, betrayals, and ceremonies so powerful they could make or break rulers. Yet today, many of them sit in ruins, their stories buried under layers of dust and legend. But that's about to change. Because in this video, we're dusting off those legends and piecing together the truth. Think about the last time you stood somewhere ancient, somewhere that made you feel small in the best possible way. That's the magic we're chasing today. From the Temple of Mithras, hidden beneath modern streets where soldiers once in secret, to the mysterious sanctuary where rites so secret no man could witness them unfolded, we're unraveling the enigmas that even historians still argue about. And here's the thing, these temples aren't just about the past, they're mirrors. They show us how power was wielded, how people sought meaning, and how cultures clashed and blended in ways that still shape our world today. So if you're ready to step beyond the guidebooks and into the shadows where history's most intriguing puzzles await, let's begin. The lost temples of Rome are calling, and their stories, they're more alive than you think. To understand why Roman temples became such central forces in society, we have to step back to the very foundations of Rome itself. Picture a small settlement on the Palatine Hill, where early Romans believed their fate was tied directly to the favor of the gods. The Temple of Jupiter wasn't just the first monumental temple, it was a statement. Towering over the city, its massive columns and gilded roof screamed one thing: Rome was here to stay. But these structures weren't just for show. Inside, priests interpreted divine will through omens, shaping decisions from when to plant crops to whether to go to war. In a world where politics and religion were inseparable, controlling a temple meant controlling the narrative of the empire. Now here where it gets fascinating. As Rome grew, so did its gods. Conquering new territories didn't just mean claiming land, it meant adopting foreign deities into the Roman pantheon. The Temple of Isis near the Tiber River is a perfect example. Originally an Egyptian goddess, Isis was embraced by Roman, her temple blending traditional Roman architecture with exotic motifs like lotus columns and hieroglyphic carvings. This wasn't just cultural borrowing, it was strategic. By welcoming foreign gods, Rome gave conquered peoples a stake in the empire while proving its own divine flexibility. But temples weren't just about gods and politics, they were social epicenters. Imagine the steps of the Temple of Saturn in the Forum, where merchants haggled, politicians gave speeches, and ordinary citizens gathered to hear the latest news. These spaces pulsed with life, hosting everything from sacred festivals to public feasts where free wine flowed. And let's not forget the money. Temples doubled as Rome's earliest banks, their vaults stuffed with gold meant for offerings, but often loaned out to fund everything from military campaigns to gladiator games. The real genius of Roman temple design, adaptability. Unlike Greek temples, which were mostly closed to the public, Roman temples invited people in literally. Raised podiums with grand staircases made them visible from all angles, while open porticos encouraged to gather. The Pantheon, though later rebuilt, took this idea even further with its revolutionary dome, symbolizing the heavens themselves. Every architectural choice sent a message. This was a religion designed to include, impress, and endure. So what happened when Christianity rose? The temples didn't vanish overnight. Some, like the Pantheon, were repurposed. Others faded into ruins, their stones plundered for new churches. But their legacy, that's etched into history. From the way modern courthouses mimic their grand staircases to the very idea of a public monument, we're still living in the shadow of Rome's sacred spaces. And that's the true power of a temple. It outlasts empires, outlives gods, and keeps whispering its stories to anyone willing to listen. At the heart of Rome's religious life stood the Temple of Vesta, not as a towering monument of marble, but as an intimate circular sanctuary where the fate of an empire literally hung by a flame. This wasn't just fire, it was the living breath of Rome. According to legend, if the sacred flame ever flickered out, disaster would follow. And so, for centuries, the Vestal virgins kept watch, their lives dedicated to this single, sacred task. Chosen between the ages of 6 and 10 from Rome's most prestigious families, these girls entered a world of contradictions. They wielded power no other women could claim, presiding over rituals, pardoning condemned prisoners, and safeguarding wills of emperors, yet their bodies were policed with terrifying scrutiny. A Vestal's chastity wasn't just personal virtue, it was the city's insurance policy. The temple itself was a mystery wrapped in symbolism. Its unusual round shape echoed prehistoric hut designs, a deliberate nod to Rome's humble beginnings. Unlike the grand staircases of Jupiter's temple, Vesta's sanctuary sat low, approachable like a hearth at the center of a home, because that's exactly what it was. The eternal flame connected every Roman household's cooking fire to the divine. But here's what most miss: the temple had no cult statue. The fire was the deity. This blurring of symbol and divinity reveals how Romans saw their gods not as distant figures, but as forces woven into daily survival. The Vestals' rituals were as precise as they were secret. Each morning they drew fresh water from a sacred spring, carried in vessels that couldn't touch the ground. They baked ritual bread with salt milled by their own hands. Even the ashes of the flame were treated as holy, scattered into the Tiber during the May purification rites. But their greatest power lay in what they didn't reveal. Unlike other priests, Vestals left no written records. Their knowledge died with them, fueling speculation for them. Were they keepers of older, darker traditions? Some scholars point to the grim punishment for broken vows, buried alive with a loaf of bread and a lamp, as evidence of ancient fertility rites gone wrong. Yet for all their mystery, the Vestals were shockingly modern in one respect: financial independence. While most Roman women lived under male guardianship, Vestals owned property in court and moved freely through the city. Their presence could stop a battle, their word could override a senator's. This wasn't feminism, it was pragmatism. Rome needed them too much to impose the usual restrictions. That tension between reverence and control played out in their clothing. The bridal veil signifying purity, but the elaborate six-braided hairstyle echoing the armor of the war god Mars. When Christianity rose, the flame was finally extinguished in the 4th century, not by neglect but by decree. The last Vestals walked away, their temple repurposed, their rituals outlawed. Yet even in ruin, the Temple of Vesta refused to vanish completely. Its circular footprint inspired Renaissance architects, and its legacy lingers in our very word, Vestal, synonymous with unwavering devotion. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. Some fires never truly die. They just wait, embers under ash, for someone to listen to what they still have to say. Beneath the bustling streets of modern Rome, where cafes spill onto cobblestones and tourists snap photos of Baroque fountains, lies a portal to another world, a place where the Nile once flowed through the heart of the empire. The Temple of Isis wasn't just another shrine. It was a sensory explosion of Egyptian mysticism transplanted onto Italian soil. Picture this: towering statues of Anubis flanking the entrance, their jackal heads gleaming under torchlight, while priests in linen robes chanted hymns to a goddess who promised what Roman gods could not: eternal life. This wasn't mere cultural borrowing, it was a spiritual revolution. Caligula's obsession with Egypt wasn't just political theater. When he expanded the temple in the 1st century, he tapped into something deeper, a craving for the exotic, the personal, the miraculous. Traditional Roman religion was transactional: sacrifice to Jupiter for victory, pour wine to Neptune for safe passage. But Isis, she offered intimacy. Followers called her the one of 10,000 names, a goddess who listened to whispers in the dark. Her rituals were immersive. Initiates bathed in sacred Nile water, wore masks of animal-headed deities, and stayed up through the night chanting under star-painted ceilings. To enter her temple was to step into a living myth. And oh, how it scandalized Rome's elite. Senators sneered at the midnight processions where women, gasped, walked unveiled, shaking sistrums in ecstatic dances. Traditionalists warned these foreign rites would corrupt Roman virtue. But the people, they flocked in droves, because Isis spoke to the marginalized in ways Jupiter never could. Enslaved people prayed to her for solace. Women sought her as a divine midwife. Even soldiers carried her amulets into battle. Her appeal was universal because her myths mirrored human struggles: love, loss, resurrection. When her priests reenacted the story of Osiris, murdered and reborn, it wasn't just theater. It was hope. The temple's design deliberately blurred borders. Hieroglyphs snaked alongside Latin inscriptions. Sphinxes lounged next to statues of Roman emperors dressed as pharaohs. This visual fusion was genius. It made the foreign feel familiar, turning exoticism into authority. Archaeologists still puzzle over fragments of the temple's Nilotic mosaic, a sprawling artwork that depicted crocodiles, pygmies, and flooded delta scenes, turning the floor into a mirror of the Nile itself. Walking here, a Roman baker or a Syrian merchant could taste the distant and divine without ever leaving the city. So why did this temple vanish? Blame seismic shifts in power. As Christianity rose, Isis's imagery was too potent to ignore. Early artists literally repurposed her iconography for the Virgin Mary. But the temple's stones didn't just disappear. They were recycled into palazzos and churches, a quiet metaphor for how Rome always absorbs what it needs. Today, a lone obelisk near the Pantheon marks where the temple once stood, its hieroglyphs now pointing at McDonald's signs. Yet in museums, delicate silver sistrums and frescoes of Isis still hum with life. They remind us that Rome wasn't just a conqueror of lands, it was a collector of dreams, where a goddess from the Nile could become the soul of an empire. The Temple of Apollo rises from history like a shattered puzzle, its surviving columns standing like sentinels guarding secrets. To understand why this sanctuary of poetry and prophecy became a monument to military might, we need to walk the footsteps of its builder. This was no ordinary general. Fresh from crushing a rebellion he returned to Rome in 34 BCE with looted treasures and a bold statement to make. In a city where victory monuments were currency, his temple didn't just honor Apollo, it weaponized him. Look closer at those reconstructed friezes, and the message screams across centuries. Scenes from the Trojan War weren't chosen randomly. Here's Hector falling to Achilles, Troy burning, myths every Roman knew by heart, but twisted the narrative. By aligning himself with Apollo, the god who guided Paris's fateful arrow, he reframed his own conquests as divinely ordained. The marble became a mirror. Just as Apollo shaped Troy's downfall, so too did become the instrument of Rome's enemies' destruction. But the genius lay in the details. Flanking the temple's entrance stood statues of Apollo's sister Diana and his mother Latona, a calculated trifecta. Diana, huntress and protector of the marginalized, appealed to plebeians. Latona, a mother figure, softened the god's warlike edge. Even the temple's location near the theater was strategic. This wasn't just a place for senators to pray. It was where crowds gathered for plays, where the public absorbed propaganda disguised as piety. The real irony, Apollo outlived its creator's ambitions. When backed Mark against Octavian, he fell from grace, yet his temple endured, repurposed by the very regime that defeated him. Later emperors added their own layers, gilding the cult statue until it gleamed like sunlight. That statue holds one last clue. Unlike traditional depictions of Apollo holding a lyre, this one gripped a bow, forever frozen mid-draw. A god of arts, yes, but never forget. He was also the one whose arrows brought plague upon the Greeks. Today, 3 re-erected columns near the theater of hint at its former glory, their Corinthian capitals still crisp with acanthus leaves. But the temple's true legacy isn't in the fragments we found, it's in what it taught Rome about power. Divine association wasn't just about reverence, it was about control. When later emperors claimed descent from gods or built altars to their own divinity, they were playing from the playbook. Even in ruin, this temple whispers a timeless lesson. The line between worship and propaganda has always been thinner than a blade of grass. Descend 20 feet below modern Rome's financial district, past layers of sewer pipes and subway tunnels, and you'll find yourself standing in a space that feels utterly alien. A dimly lit cavern where the air itself seems heavy with ancient secrets. This is the Temple of Mithras, a window into a cult so shrouded in mystery that even its most dedicated followers took vows of silence to the grave. Unlike the sunlit temples of Jupiter or Isis, Mithras' sanctuaries were deliberately hidden underground, accessible only to those who'd proven themselves worthy. The ceiling here is low, the walls rough-hewn, every detail designed to simulate the sacred cave where, according to legend, the god Mithras slew the primordial bull and brought life to the world. Step into the main chamber and your eyes adjust to the faint glow of oil lamps flickering across the temple's centerpiece. This intricate relief carving shows Mithras mid-strike, his dagger plunged into the bull's throat while a dog and serpent lap at the blood. At first glance, it's violent, but look closer. Every element crackles with coded meaning. The scorpion gripping the bull's genitals, a nod to the constellation Scorpio, the cloak billowing behind Mithras. That's the night sky itself, embroidered with stars. This wasn't just art, it was a cosmic map, a visual hymn to the order Mithras imposed on chaos. Initiation here wasn't for the faint of heart. Imagine a young soldier, blindfolded and led down narrow steps, his heart pounding as chants echoed off damp walls. The rituals were physical, psychological, even theatrical. Some accounts describe mock battles where initiates dueled in darkness. Others hint at feasts where wine became blood and bread became flesh, centuries before the Eucharist. And then there were the grades, 7 levels of advancement, each tied to a planet, from the raven, Mercury's messenger, to the father, Saturn's wisdom. Climbing this ladder meant enduring everything from branding to staged deaths and rebirths. Why did this cult captivate Rome's military elite? Because Mithras didn't offer salvation, he offered brotherhood. In an empire where legions were posted to distant frontiers, the cult became a portable family. Its values, discipline, loyalty, unwavering courage mirrored army life perfectly. But there was also something subversive at play. Unlike the state-sponsored cult of Jupiter, Mithraism thrived in the shadows, its members bound not by rank but by shared ordeal. When 2 soldiers recognized each other as initiates, they'd exchange coded phrases like, "The lion has drunk the wine," forging instant trust across ethnic divides. The temple's alignment reveals another layer of genius. On the winter solstice, sunlight would pierce the narrow entrance, striking a silver disk placed above illuminating the god's face for one transcendent moment. This celestial choreography wasn't just spectacle. It tied Mithras to Saul, the unconquered son, whose cult Emperor Aurelian later co-opted to unify the empire. By then, Mithraism's influence was waning, its temples abandoned or repurposed by Christians who saw its imagery as dangerously similar to their own. Yet echoes linger. In London's financial district, another was discovered beneath an office, its artifacts preserved by the same mud that buried Rome's version. And that's the haunting truth about Mithras: his temples refuse to stay buried. They keep resurfacing, literal and metaphorical reminders that Rome's spiritual landscape was far messier, far more diverse than textbooks suggest. What really transpired in those underground chambers, the walls won't tell. But the silence itself is a clue. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved, only experienced. The Temple of Saturn's weathered columns, still standing proud in the Roman Forum, tell a story far richer than their crumbling surfaces suggest. This wasn't just another shrine, it was the beating heart of Rome's economy, a place where gold and gods mingled in ways that would make modern bankers blush. Step inside and you'd find the state treasury, its vaults stuffed with taxes from conquered provinces, war booty, and the personal fortunes of senators held as collateral. But here's the twist. This financial powerhouse was dedicated to a god associated with a time before money even existed. Saturn's mythology painted him as the ruler of a lost golden age, a utopia where no one toiled and the earth freely provided all. Romans celebrated this paradox every December during Saturnalia, a festival so anarchic it would put modern New Year's Eve to shame. For a week, slaves dined at their masters' tables, gambling was legal in public, and social hierarchies dissolved into laughter and wine. The temple itself became the epicenter of this controlled chaos, its statue of Saturn, usually bound with woolen bands, temporarily freed from its restraints. This ritual wasn't just fun and games, it was a pressure valve for a society built on rigid order, a fleeting taste of the equality Saturn once promised. So how did a god of agricultural abundance become the patron of cold, hard cash? The answer lies in Rome's genius for turning myth into infrastructure. Saturn's association with sowing and harvests made him a natural symbol of wealth generation, but it was his link to liberation that sealed the deal. Just as Saturnalia temporarily freed slaves from bondage, the temple's treasury offered literal freedom. Funds here bought the manumission of enslaved people, transforming them into citizens. Even the temple's design whispered this duality. Its high podium and imposing facade radiated state authority, yet the open space beneath the stairs served as Rome's earliest public notice board, where laws and debts were posted for all to see. The real magic happened in the shadows. Senators' new loans from Saturn's coffers could spark wars or quell rebellions, but the temple also safeguarded something more precious: Rome's financial identity. When emperors later minted coins, they stamped them with Saturn's image, tying currency to the nostalgia of his golden age. It was of propaganda. Money wasn't just metal. It was a fragment of a better past, a promise that prosperity could return. Today, as you walk past those iconic Ionic columns, notice the grooves worn into the stone steps by centuries of sandaled feet. Those marks aren't just from priests or accountants. They're from ordinary Romans who came to pay debts, plead for loans, or simply bask in the glow of a god who embodied their deepest contradictions. A deity who represented both the weight of wealth and the lightness of freedom, forever bound together in the mortar of this extraordinary temple. The temple didn't just host Rome's war councils, it performed them. Picture this: a senator, his toga edged in purple, standing before the goddess's blood-spattered altar, gripping a spear. Beneath his feet, a square of earth taken from some distant frontier, Gaul, Carthage, Macedonia, soil that moments ago was foreign, now ritually marked as Rome's by the arc of that thrown spear. This wasn't just symbolism, it was legal alchemy. By bringing the battlefield to temple, Rome turned war into a sacred act, one that required divine approval before a single sword was drawn. But here's what most miss. That same space where spears flew also hosted envoys from the very nations Rome threatened. The temple's portico, known as the, became neutral ground where ambassadors pleaded for peace, their voices competing with the clang of priests' blades as they gashed their own arms in frenzied devotion. How could brutality and diplomacy share a roof? Because Rome understood something timeless. Power isn't just seized, it's staged. This theater of conflict reminded everyone negotiation wasn't kindness but strategy. When Persian or Greek delegates saw those self-mutilating priests, they weren't just witnessing madness. They were seeing Rome's willingness to spill its own blood for victory, a message sharper than any spear. The goddess herself embodied this duality. Artists depicted her with a torch in one hand, an olive branch in the other, fire to destroy, but also light to guide. Her festivals swung between extremes. The Dies' Day of Blood saw whip themselves until the temple steps ran red, while the feast laid out couches for gods and diplomats alike, sharing meals under the same roof where war was born. Modern excavations near the circus reveal another layer. The temple's foundation stones bear grooves from chariot wheels, not from battles but from triumphal processions. Generals returning victorious would circle shrine before entering the city, their prisoners and loot on display. Yet those same grooves also trace the path of defeated kings walking to sue for terms. The stones don't distinguish between conqueror and conquered because Rome didn't either. To dominate was to absorb, to turn enemies into subjects, then citizens. Perhaps that's real legacy. Her temple wasn't just where wars began, it was where they ended, where the screaming of priests gave way to the quiet scratching of scribes drafting treaties. Today, a lone fragment of her altar sits in the museums, its surface pitted by blade marks and wine stains. A fitting relic for a goddess who knew true power isn't choosing between war and peace, but mastering the rhythm between them. The arrival of Cybele's meteorite black idol on Rome's shores in 204 BCE wasn't just a religious event, it was an act of desperation. Hannibal's army was crushing Roman legions, the countryside burned, and the Sibylline books, Rome's ancient prophetic scrolls, had spoken. Only the Great Mother could save them. But this wasn't a gentle goddess. Cybele demanded blood, ecstasy, and sacrifices that would make even battle-hardened senators blanch. Her priests, the Galli, castrated themselves in her honor, their high-pitched wails and flowing robes scandalizing a society that prized masculine discipline above all. Yet Rome knelt before her anyway, because when survival hung in the balance, tradition was a luxury they couldn't afford. The temple itself stood on the Palatine Hill, a deliberate choice. By placing Cybele beside the hut of Romulus, the mythical birthplace of Rome, the state sent a clear message. This foreign deity was now family. But the rituals performed here were anything but domesticated. Each April during the festival, the streets transformed into a riot of color and chaos. Noble families hosted feasts for the poor, while the Galli paraded through the city, beating drums and slashing their arms, their blood splattering the statue of the goddess they carried. The climax came when her sacred stone was bathed in the Tiber, a ritual so potent that bystanders would plunge into the river afterward, desperate to absorb its blessings. What's fascinating is just Rome's tolerance of these extremes. It's how they sanitized them for public consumption. Yes, the Galli were forbidden to recruit Roman citizens. Yes, their castration rites had to occur outside the city walls, but behind closed doors, the elite couldn't get enough. Private Cybele cults flourished among wealthy women who saw in the goddess a power their own society them. Even the Emperor Claudius, that stodgy historian, officially added her rites to the state calendar. Because Cybele offered something Jupiter never could, raw, unfiltered transcendence. The temple's architecture reflected this tension. Its facade was classically Roman, with stately columns and a triangular pediment. But inside, the altar held a secret, a hollow space where the Galli stored their testicular relics. Yes, that's exactly what you think, wrapped in silk and spices. This grotesque detail underscores the cult's real appeal. In a world where religion was often transactional, sacrifice for favor, Cybele demanded total surrender. Her followers didn't just worship, they became her, blurring the line between human and divine in ways that terrified and thrilled. By the 4th century, as Christianity rose, Cybele's temple was abandoned, her rites recast as demonic. But look closer at early Christian art, and you'll spot her influence everywhere. The Virgin Mary's coronation scenes, they borrow directly from Cybele's iconography as Queen of Heaven. Even the practice of fasting before Easter echoes the Great Mother's springtime mourning for her lover Attis. Rome may have turned its back on her temple, but Cybele's shadow lingers. A reminder that even the wildest gods can shape history, if only we're brave enough to embrace them. The Temple of Hercules Victor stands like a quiet sentinel by the Tiber, its circular form a striking anomaly among Rome's angular ruins. Walk inside and you're stepping into the private devotion of men who moved mountains, or at least mountains of goods. This wasn't commissioned by emperors or generals, but by oil merchants and shipowners whose fortunes depended on the whims of storms and pirates. Their choice of Hercules as patron was no accident. Here was a god who crossed deserts, slain monsters, and even descended into the underworld, the ultimate traveler, protector of those who dared to venture beyond safe harbors. Look closer at the temple's design and you'll spot clues to its builder's world. The 20 Corinthian columns aren't just beautiful, they're a statement of connectivity. Carved from gleaming white marble in Greece, shipped across the Mediterranean and polished by Egyptian craftsmen, each one represents a link in the vast chain of Roman commerce. The circular floor plan, rare for Roman temples, echoes the round markets where deals were struck from Gaul to Carthage. Even the temple's location shouts its purpose, perched beside where barges unloaded spices from Arabia and tin from Cornwall. But the real revelation lies in the votive offerings found buried beneath its foundations. Tiny lead ships, their sails etched with prayers for safe passage. Clay tablets inscribed in Aramaic by Syrian traders. A glass bead from India, worn smooth by anxious fingers. These weren't state-sanctioned gifts to appease some official deity. They were personal pleas from men who risked everything on the tides. Hercules here wasn't just a mythic hero, he was the divine notary witnessing contracts, the celestial guard dog watching over warehouses. The temple's survival into modern times is its own kind of miracle. When early Christians repurposed it as Maria del Sol, they scraped away the frescoes of Hercules' labors but left the structure intact, perhaps because even they recognized something sacred in its geometry. That circular space, after all, had always been more than stone. It was a physical promise, a merchant's handshake with the divine. When a trader nailed his donation to the temple wall, he wasn't just buying favor. He was etching his name into the story of a city built on motion, on exchange, on the courage to send a ship into the unknown and trust it would return. Today, as sunlight filters through those ancient columns, you can almost hear the echoes of deals sealed with oaths and wine. The olive merchant from boasting of his finest amphory, the silk trader from Antioch nervously checking the river for his delayed shipment. Hercules watched over them all, his club resting lightly on his shoulder, a reminder that even in the ruthless world of commerce, some promises were meant to be kept. The temple doesn't tower over Rome like the Pantheon or whisper secrets like the underground it hums. A steady, rhythmic hum of oars slicing water, of dockworkers shouting over crates of Egyptian grain, of ropes creaking as ships from Spain and North Africa tied up just steps from its doors. This compact, boxy structure with its elegant Ionic columns was never meant to awe. It was built to work. The god it honored wasn't some cosmic ruler but a divine doorkeeper, the protector of quays and harbors, the guardian of thresholds between river and road, foreign and familiar. What's extraordinary isn't just that this temple survived when grander ones crumbled. It's how it functioned as a spiritual customs house. Before merchants could unload their cargo they'd stop here to leave offerings. Miniature anchors carved from bone, wax seals stamped with prayers for fair winds, even tiny wooden ships filled with incense. Archaeologists found one such votive buried beneath the temple's foundation, its hull inscribed with the plea, "Turn no ship away." This wasn't lofty theology. It was the gritty reality of a city that lived and died by what floated up its river. The temple's design tells its own story. Unlike the imposing staircases of Jupiter's, its porch sits low, almost at street level, a deliberate choice. This was a god who met people where they were, who understood the urgency of a trader needing to unload perishable goods before sunset. Even the columns, slender and unfluted, suggest speed and efficiency, their capitals decorated not with elaborate mythological scenes, but simple, repeating volutes. Every architectural choice whispered the same message: commerce waits for no one. But here, where it gets fascinating. When Christianity took hold, the temple didn't fall into ruin, it transformed. By the 5th century, it was rededicated as Maria, named after a repentant prostitute turned desert saint. At first glance, the pairing seems bizarre, a harbor god's shrine becoming a hermit's church, yet it makes eerie sense. Both and Mary of Egypt governed transitions, one between land and water, the other between sin and redemption. The temple's repurposing wasn't just practical, it was poetic. Today, standing between the temple and the Tiber, you can still trace the grooves in the stone where carts loaded with Sardinian wheat and Greek wine rolled toward the warehouses. The river itself is quieter now, its banks tamed by modern embankments. But the temple endures, a testament to the unsung deities who kept Rome fed, funded, and connected to the world. Its resilience reminds us that empires aren't built on epic battles alone. They're sustained by the quiet gods of logistics, the divine middlemen who make sure the goods and the glory keep flowing. Standing in the shadow of the Temple of, and you can still read the words carved into its massive architrave. To the divine and the divine, but this isn't just another imperial shrine. Touch the weathered marble, and you're touching one of Rome's most enduring love stories, one that the cutthroat politics of empire. When died in 141 CE, didn't just mourn, he poured his grief into stone, erecting this temple in the heart of the Forum where senators and citizens alike would pass it daily. The gesture was unprecedented, a public monument to private devotion, blurring the line between husband and emperor, woman and goddess. Look past the temple's later Christian additions, the Baroque frescoes of San and Miranda, and you'll spot traces of its original brilliance. The delicate floral friezes winding around the columns weren't mere decoration. They whispered of Persephone's return from the underworld, a subtle promise that death wasn't the end. Even the temple's orientation was deliberate, aligned so that on its birthday, dawn light would strike the cult statue's face, bathing her in gold. This wasn't just architecture, it was a love letter in limestone. Why did this couple capture Rome's imagination? In an era when emperors were expected to take mistresses and marriages were political chess moves, and its 30-year union was scandalously harmonious. No poison plots, no exiled wives, just mutual respect so striking that coins minted during their reign showed them clasping hands, the words Concordia stamped beneath. Wasn't relegated to the shadows. She advised on policy, funded schools for girls, and traveled with on military campaigns. When gossipers claimed she'd been unfaithful, the emperor's response became legendary. I'd rather trust the woman I chose than the rumors others spread. But don't mistake this for pure romance. The temple's dual dedication after its death reveals the shrewdness beneath the sentiment. By binding their names together in perpetuity, Ensured's legacy would bolster his own. Those same coins bearing their joined hands, they circulated for decades, reinforcing the myth of a golden age under the Pew's emperor, a title earned, historians say, partly for his refusal to execute senators, but mostly for his very public grief. Even the temple's repurposing as a church in the 8th century played into this narrative. Where other pagan sites were razed, this one endured, its story of devotion sanitized for Christian who still sought blessings for their marriages at its altar. Today, as pigeons nest in the temple's pediment, it's easy to overlook the quiet rebellion it represents. In a world where power so often corrupted love, here was a monument that insisted the inverse could also be true, that love, carefully staged, could become its own kind of power. The cracks in its facade don't diminish that message, they amplify it. Because 2,000 years later, we're still piecing together the puzzle of two people who dared to let their private affection shape public memory. And perhaps that's the most radical act of all. Hadrian didn't just build temples, he staged revolutions in stone. The Temple of Venus in Roma wasn't merely large, it was a deliberate provocation, its twin chambers facing opposite directions like two empires back to back. Picture the scene. Venus, goddess of love and divine ancestor of Rome, gazing toward the Colosseum, while her counterpart Roma, the armored embodiment of the city itself, stared down the sacred way toward the Forum. This architectural duality was Hadrian's boldest statement. Rome wasn't just a place, but an idea both eternal and evolving. The backlash was immediate. Of Damascus, Rome's star architect, famously sneered that the goddesses would need to stand if they ever wanted to see each other, mocking the temple's squat proportions. Hadrian's response, he exiled and possibly ordered his execution. This wasn't just petty vengeance, it was a declaration that Rome's new aesthetic would prioritize symbolism over tradition. The temple's sprawling dimensions, 145 meters long, nearly double the Parthenon's length, forced visitors to physically experience Hadrian's vision. Walking from Venus's chamber to Roma's meant traversing the gap between myth and reality. But here's what most historians miss. The temple's true innovation lay beneath the marble. While other shrines had underground chambers for storage or rituals, Hadrian's team engineered a hidden corridor between the cella, allowing priests to move offerings unseen. This wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. In one sanctuary would hear distant chants from the other, a sensory reminder that Rome's past and present were forever intertwined. Even the materials whispered of empire. Pink granite columns from Egypt, golden yellow Numidian marble for the floors, and a coffered ceiling gilded with gold from Dacia's conquered mines. The temple's survival through earthquakes, fires, and medieval stone robbing is its own kind of miracle. Today, you can still trace the outlines of the colossal platforms near the Colosseum, where Renaissance artists like Michelangelo sketched the ruins, marveling at how Hadrian had turned worship into a spatial poem. Those fragmented columns and scattered capitals aren't just rubble, they're pages from a manifesto. Because this temple wasn't built for the gods alone. It was a challenge to every citizen who passed it. Could they see, as Hadrian did, that Rome's greatness lay not in clinging to the past, but in holding it in tension with the future? The answer, like the temple itself, stands in ruins, but the question lingers, as eternal as Venus's gaze. Those three solitary columns rising from the Forum's pavement tell a story far grander than their weathered surfaces suggest. The Temple of Castor and Pollux wasn't just another shrine. It was Rome's original press conference stage, financial hub, and divine PR campaign rolled into one. Picture the scene after the Battle of Lake in 496 BCE, when two mysterious horsemen, their armor gleaming despite the dust of combat, dismounted to water their steeds at this very spot. By the time their footprints vanished from the spring's edge, Rome had its first celebrity deities. The twins weren't merely, they were co-opted, transformed from Greek myth into Roman mascots of military might. What's fascinating isn't just that the temple commemorated this legend, it's how Romans weaponized the story. Every time a general stood on its podium to announce a victory, every time a senator cited divine favor during budget debates, they reinforced the narrative. Rome didn't win battles. The gods won them for Rome. The temple's location was no accident either. Perched beside the sacred way, where triumphal processions passed, its steps became a theater of power. When Cicero exposed conspiracy from this very spot, he wasn't just addressing the Senate. He was performing under the twins' watchful gaze, wrapping his words in divine authority. Dig deeper and the ruins reveal another layer. Those iconic columns, they're not from the original temple. They're part of a lavish rebuild commissioned by Tiberius in 6 CE, a project so expensive it nearly drained the treasury. Why pour fortunes into a 1,000-year-old myth? Because the twins had evolved. No longer just battle heroes, they'd become patrons of the equestrian class, Rome's bankers, tax collectors, and entrepreneurs. The temple's second life as a financial center made sense. Who better to oversee contracts and loans than deities who'd once guaranteed victories? Even the architecture whispered this duality. The lofty podium symbolized military triumph, while the ground-level annex housed the officials who regulated debt during crises. But here's the twist that still baffles historians. Unlike other Roman gods with clear-cut domains, Castor and Pollux blurred boundaries. Their cult statues showed them as identical youths, yet one was mortal, the other divine. They were horsemen who also protected sailors, warriors who presided over commerce. This fluidity was their superpower. When Roman legions marched into Gaul or Britain, they didn't carry Jupiter's thunderbolts. They carried the twins' imagery on standards, a reminder that Rome's expansion was both destiny and business opportunity. Today, as afternoon light slants between those lonely columns, you can almost hear the echoes of centuries of deal-making and speechifying. The cracks in the marble aren't just signs of age, they're fractures in the facade of a carefully constructed myth. Because the truth is, Rome didn't need the twins to win battles. It needed them to explain winning, to turn conquest into something inevitable, even familial. And that's the real magic of this temple. It wasn't built for the gods. It was built for the mortals who knew that faith, when staged just right, could be the sharpest sword in the empire's arsenal. The Temple of Concord stands as one of Rome's greatest paradoxes, a monument to unity built atop fault lines of class warfare. Its foundation in 367 BCE followed the resolution of the plebeian revolt, a bloody conflict that nearly tore the Republic apart. The Senate's message was clear. This shrine would commemorate peace between patricians and plebeians, a physical reminder that Rome's strength lay in harmony. But walk through its halls centuries later, and you'd find no trace of that idealism. Instead, the air would have been thick with tension, the marble floors echoing with the footsteps of politicians plotting against one another. Take Cicero's famous denunciation of in 63 BCE standing on the temple steps. The orator didn't just expose a conspiracy, he weaponized the space itself. Every reference to Concord from his lips dripped with irony as he accused his rival of scheming to burn the city. The temple's art collection, a dazzling array of Greek statues and captured treasures, became mere backdrop to the political theater. Even the statues seemed to watch in silent judgment, as Rome's elite tore each other apart beneath a roof meant to shelter unity. The temple's transformation under the emperors only deepened the irony. After the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Vespasian filled its halls with looted Jewish relics, the menorah from the Second Temple, the silver trumpets of the priests. These spoils weren't just trophies, they were symbols of conquest masquerading as cultural exchange. The message was unmistakable. Rome's version of Concord came at the point of a sword. Even the temple's famous sundial, designed to mark the equinoxes in perfect balance, cast shadows over stolen wealth. Yet for all its failures, the Temple of Concord holds a mirror to our own struggles. Its name alone, repeated in courthouses and capitals worldwide, speaks to an eternal human longing. We build monuments to ideals we can't quite live up to, hoping the stones will remember what we so often forget. The next time you hear the word reconciliation, picture those cracked Corinthian columns in the Forum. They remind us that harmony isn't a destination, but a journey, one that begins not with grand temples, but with the far harder work of listening across the divides we've spent constructing. The Temple of Janus wasn't made of gold or marble. It was built from something far more powerful, collective belief. Picture a small, unassuming shrine, its bronze doors weathered by centuries of touch, standing at the northern edge of the Roman Forum. Or maybe it was near the theater of, or by the. Here, the fascinating part. Even ancient historians couldn't agree on its exact location. Livy placed it in one spot, Ovid another. This uncertainty isn't just an archaeological puzzle, it's the key to understanding why Janus mattered. In a city obsessed with monuments that scrape the sky, this elusive temple derived its power from being everywhere and nowhere at once. Those famous doors tell the real story. Unlike other gods who demanded sacrifices or festivals, Janus asked only for awareness. When Rome was at war, which was almost always, the doors stood open, a visceral reminder that conflict shaped daily life. But when the doors closed, that's when history held its breath. Augustus's triple closure wasn't just political theater, it was a psychological. After centuries of near-constant warfare, the sudden silence of those bronze hinges swinging shut would have been deafening. Imagine a marketplace trader pausing mid-deal, a soldier glancing over his shoulder. For the first time in living memory, Rome wasn't fighting anyone. The absence of war became its own kind of spectacle. Yet Janus was more than a divine light switch. His two faces, one gazing backward, one forward, embodied Rome's deepest tension between tradition and expansion. The temple's rituals reflected this duality. During wartime, generals would march through the open doors before campaigns, symbolically entering a realm where past strategies and future victories coexisted. The act wasn't just ceremonial, it acknowledged a brutal truth that every Roman peace was simply war waiting to happen. Even the temple's shape whispered this paradox. Some sources describe it as a simple passageway, a physical manifestation of transition. The mystery of its location only deepens the metaphor. Without ruins to fix it in place, the Temple of Janus floats through history, appearing wherever Rome needed to measure its own conscience. Modern scholars debate whether it was even a traditional temple at all, or more of a ceremonial gateway. That ambiguity feels intentional. Because how do you pin down a god of thresholds, of beginnings and endings, in a city that constantly redefined both? The answer might lie not in lost foundations, but in the thousands of Roman coins minted with Janus's image, a portable temple carried in every merchant's purse, a reminder that some boundaries exist to be crossed. Perhaps that's why Augustus made such fanfare about closing the doors. In an empire stretching from Britain to Babylon, true peace was impossible. But the idea of peace, that could be manufactured, polished, and wielded like the ultimate imperial tool. The Temple of Janus didn't need walls to endure. It thrived in the space between what Rome was and what it pretended to be, a lesson etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of a people forever standing on the threshold of war and peace. The Temple of Diana on the hill didn't just welcome the marginalized, it celebrated them. Picture this, a runaway slave, their feet still raw from miles of night travel, stepping into the temple's moonlit courtyard. Instead of chains, they'd find sanctuary. Instead of punishment, a chance to pin their shackles to the goddess's sacred oak as offerings. This wasn't just tolerance, it was radical hospitality in a society where class lines were etched in stone. Founded by Servius, Rome's legendary plebeian king, the temple's very existence was a quiet rebellion. While Jupiter's temple loomed over the city as a symbol of patrician power, Diana's sanctuary on the became the people's counterbalance, a place where even the lowest could claim divine protection. The founding myth tells of a miraculous stag, its antlers gleaming like polished bronze, leading Servius to the sacred grove where the temple would stand. That stag wasn't just a sign from the gods, it was a symbol of Diana's domain. As goddess of the wild edges, she ruled forests where societal hierarchies dissolved, where hunted creatures could vanish into shadow. Her temple embodied that same spirit. The rituals here norms. Women could serve as priestesses, foreigners could participate in festivals, and the annual festival turned Rome's rigid order upside down. For 3 days in August, the streets filled with torchlit processions of and artisans, their hair woven with wildflowers, carrying petitions for Diana's protection. But don't mistake this for ancient progressivism. The temple's inclusivity served Rome's rulers as much as its rebels. By funneling plebeian grievances into religious expression, the state prevented unrest from boiling over into revolt. The temple's famed asylum law granting safety to fugitives wasn't just compassion, it was crowd control. Historians note how runaway slaves who took refuge here weren't freed outright, but often became temple servants, trading one form of labor for another. Even the goddess's dual identity as Diana and her Greek counterpart Artemis allowed Rome to absorb foreign without destabilizing the core pantheon. Yet for all its political pragmatism, the temple's legacy endures as something more profound. In its ruins, archaeologists have found humble offerings, terracotta figurines of mothers with children, crude wooden carvings of healing limbs, lead curse tablets pleading for justice against cruel masters. These artifacts whisper of real people who saw in Diana not just a divine huntress, but an advocate. When early Christians later repurposed the site as the Church of, they kept alive its spirit of refuge, proof that some sanctuaries transcend the gods they're built for. The temple's true power lay in its paradox, a space that both challenged and sustained Rome's hierarchy, where the oppressed could taste dignity without overturning the system. That tension still resonates, because in the end, Diana's greatest miracle wasn't her mythical stag. It was convincing an empire built on conquest to leave one door open for the conquered. The Temple of Mars didn't just dominate the Forum of Augustus, it rewrote Rome's origin story in marble and blood. Picture the scene on its dedication day in 2 BCE. The gleaming white columns framing a bronze statue of Mars, his cloak still flecked with gilding from Parthian loot, while Augustus himself stood before the altar holding the very daggers that had killed Caesar. This wasn't just a memorial, it was a reckoning. Every detail, from the swords displayed like holy relics to the frescoes depicting the gods sanctioning Rome's wars, screamed one message: the empire's violent past had been, its future unchallengeable. Look closer at the temple's sculptures and you'll catch the genius of Augustus' propaganda. The pediment's central trio, Mars, Venus, and the Julius Caesar, wasn't just mythic decoration. It was a family tree carved in stone, binding Augustus' rule to divine lineage. Venus, as ancestor of the Julian clan, rested her hand on Mars' shoulder while the war god's foot crushed a Parthian standard. The symbolism was razor-sharp, love and war intertwined, legitimizing conquest as destiny. Even the temple's orientation was calculated. Situated so that armies marching east would pass beneath its shadow, it turned every military campaign into a continuation of Augustus' sacred vendetta. But the real power lay in the rituals. Before any general departed for battle, he'd stand in the temple's inner sanctum, surrounded by the recovered legionary standards lost at a humiliation now reversed. The message was clear. Under Augustus, Rome didn't suffer defeats, it avenged them. Senators swore oaths here, their hands hovering over the very weapons that murdered Caesar, a chilling reminder of what happened to those who challenged the new order. Even the temple's treasury functioned as a psychological weapon. Filled with Parthian gold and pearls, it displayed Rome's plunder behind iron grills, not just wealth, but proof of enemies humbled. Was any of this truly sacred? In a way, yes. Augustus didn't just exploit religion, he reinvented it. By making Mars the patron of his vengeance, he turned personal grief into state doctrine. The temple's festivals blurred the line between worship and loyalty oath. During the soldiers paraded past altars dripping with sacrifices, while poets recited verses linking Augustus' victories to Rome's cosmic triumph. This was faith as performance art, with the emperor as both high priest and lead actor. Yet for all its calculated grandeur, the temple held moments of raw humanity. Archaeologists found tiny lead curse tablets buried in its foundations, pleas from soldiers' wives for safe returns, scrawled petitions from merchants fearing bandits. Even in this monument to imperial might, ordinary Romans whispered their private fears. That duality is the temple's true legacy. It stood as both sword and shield, a weapon to enforce obedience, but also a promise that chaos would never again consume Rome. When the Goths sacked the city centuries later, they left Mars' column standing, perhaps because some ruins speak too powerfully even to conquerors. The Temple of Minerva Medica rises from the earth like a half-buried jewel, its brick dome cracked but defiant against the weight of centuries. Step inside what was likely a lavish nymphaeum, a monumental fountain house, and you're standing in of Roman engineering. Those ribs radiating across the ceiling aren't just decoration. They're the skeleton of a revolutionary design, distributing weight so precisely that this structure outlasted empires. But the real mystery isn't how it survived, it's why we still call it a temple at all. The answer lies in a single misplaced statue, Minerva, goddess of wisdom, cradling Asclepius' serpent, that universal symbol of healing. Some eager Renaissance antiquarians saw those entwined figures and jumped to conclusions, branding the site forever. Yet the mistake is oddly fitting. Rome never drew hard lines between intellect and medicine, between the mind's brilliance and the body's care. Look closer at those walls and you'll spot the ghosts of pipes that once fed cascading water into pools below. This wasn't just a showpiece, it was a sensory experience, where the splash of fountains mingled with the murmur of philosophers debating under that soaring dome. The space embodied the very connection its misnamed statue represented: wisdom as a restorative force, as vital to the city's health as any physician's remedy. Scholars now think wealthy patrons might have hosted gatherings here, blending intellectual salons with the therapeutic Roman obsession with water cures. Imagine the scene: statesmen soaking their feet in marble basins while poets recited verses about Minerva's owl, its wide eyes seeing truths hidden in darkness. What's truly remarkable is how the building's form followed its function. That dome, an early experiment with concrete's possibilities, wasn't just structural genius, it was acoustic alchemy. The curvature amplified whispers, turning confidential medical advice or philosophical musings into intimate exchanges, even in a crowded hall. Later architects would borrow this trick for Christian baptistries, but here it served a pantheon of ideas. And when Rome's priorities shifted, the structure adapted effortlessly. Unlike temples wedded to single deities, this fluid space transitioned from nymphaeum to Renaissance garden folly to railway workers' storage shed without losing its essential grace. The fragments of colored marble clinging to the walls hint at its original opulence: green serpentine from Greece, purple porphyry from Egypt, a mosaic of imported luxuries mirroring Rome's hunger for imported knowledge. Greek physicians, Egyptian alchemists, and Persian scholars all contributed to the empire's medical advancements, their ideas swirling together like the eddies in those long-vanished pools. Maybe that's why the Temple of Minerva Medica endures. It's not just a relic of concrete innovation, but a testament to Rome's quietest revolution, the belief that healing wasn't just about potions or scalpels, but about creating spaces where minds and bodies could mend together. The dome still stands open to the sky, as if waiting for the next great idea to take root beneath its fractured embrace. The Temple of Sol stood as Rome's final gamble, a last, desperate attempt to weld a splintering empire together under the glare of a single, all-powerful sun. Emperor Aurelian didn't just build this temple in 274 CE, he weaponized it. After years of civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse, Rome needed more than legions to survive. It needed a divine anchor. Saul, with his radiant crown and promise of eternal victory, wasn't chosen by accident. This was a God who rose each morning without fail, whose light touched every corner of the known world, just as Aurelian dreamed his rule might. Walk through the temple's ruins today near the hill, and you'll find echoes of its calculated brilliance. The alignment was no accident, built to catch the first dawn light on the winter solstice, when the sun seemed to pause before its rebirth. That moment, December 25th, became the heart of the cult's rituals. Priests in gold-embroidered robes would lead chants as the rising sun struck a polished bronze disc, flooding the sanctuary with blinding light. Called it the birth of the unconquered sun, a celebration of renewal so potent that later Christian leaders quietly co-opted the date, rebranding it as Christmas. The parallels don't stop there. Saul's halo-like crown, the emphasis on divine light, even the tradition of gift-giving during the festival, all would find new life in Christian iconography. But why did this particular cult resonate so deeply in Rome's final century? Look beyond the pageantry and you'll find a people starved for certainty. In an empire where emperors were murdered faster than statues could be carved, Saul offered something revolutionary: cosmic order. His movement across the sky was predictable, mathematical, untouched by human chaos. Unlike Jupiter's temper or Mars' bloodlust, Saul's rules never changed. That reliability was catnip to a society on the brink. Soldiers clutched amulets stamped with his image, merchants swore oaths by his eternal light, and Aurelian himself minted coins proclaiming Saul as the companion of emperors. It was monotheism with training wheels, a single supreme god who tolerated the old pantheon as minor spirits, making the transition palatable to traditionalists. The temple's destruction in the 4th century wasn't just the end of a building, it was the closing act of pagan Rome. Yet Saul refused to fade completely. That halo circling Christian saints' heads, borrowed directly from Saul's iconography. The timing of Christmas, a strategic overlay onto his birthday. Even the word Sunday preserves his legacy. The unconquered sun had lost the battle, but in ways both subtle and profound, he shaped the war. Standing in the shadow of his ruined temple, you can almost hear the whispers of a question Rome never fully answered. Can an empire ever truly die if its light keeps finding new ways to shine? The temple wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a conspiracy of women in plain sight. Tucked away near the hill, its unassuming facade hid rituals so secret that even the most powerful men in Rome could only speculate about what transpired inside. Imagine the scene each December 4th. The heavy oak doors barred, the windows draped with vines, and the air thick with the scent of sacred herbs as Rome's elite women, matrons, priestesses, even the Vestals, gathered to honor a goddess whose true name they weren't permitted to speak aloud. This wasn't piety as usual. It was a night when the rules of the patriarchal world outside were suspended, and the temple became a realm where women held absolute power. The scandal that ripped the veil off these mysteries reads like a political thriller. In 62 BCE, a young patrician named disguised himself as a female musician to sneak into the rites, allegedly to seduce Caesar's wife. His discovery sent shockwaves through Rome. Cicero's blistering prosecution speech painted the intrusion as sacrilege threatening the very fabric of the Republic. But beneath the outrage lay a deeper anxiety. What were these women doing that warranted such lethal secrecy? Ancient sources drip with titillating hints. Wine flowing despite the official pretense of abstinence, dances that scandalized even seasoned senators' wives, and whispered rumors of rituals invoking fertility powers older than Rome itself. Look past the gossip, and the temple's architecture tells its own story. Excavations reveal an unusual feature: a serpent coiled around the cult statue's arm, its mouth open near a bowl of milk. This wasn't the menacing serpent of Christian tradition, but a symbol of renewal, its shedding skin mirroring cycles of birth and healing. The temple's storied herb garden, tended exclusively by women, supplied remedies for everything from childbirth pains to infertility. Some scholars believe this rites preserved elements of pre-Roman Italic traditions, where women acted as healers and keepers of botanical wisdom, long suppressed by Rome's male-dominated medical establishment. What truly unsettled Rome's elite wasn't the wine or the dancing. It was the temple's role as a nexus of female networking. In a society where women couldn't vote or hold office, this cult offered something revolutionary, a space where matrons could exchange political intelligence, broker marriages, and influence policy without male intermediaries. When Cicero later mocked by calling him the women's man, he wasn't just slinging mud. He was revealing a genuine fear that these gatherings could undermine the patriarchal order. The temple's fate mirrors Rome's uneasy relationship with female autonomy. After Augustus' moral reforms, the rites were sanitized, their wilder edges trimmed to fit imperial domesticity. Yet even in decline, this legacy persisted. Early Christian writers reluctantly admitted her priestesses' medical prowess, and some of her herbal knowledge likely survived in medieval convent gardens. Today, all that remains is a fragment of the altar in the Palazzo Museum, its surface worn smooth by centuries of secret touches. But those grooves tell a truth Rome couldn't erase, that even in the most rigid societies, the excluded will always carve out spaces to whisper, to heal, and to remember what power feels like in their own hands. High above the bustling streets of Rome, on the slopes of the hill, the Temple of Jupiter stood as a testament to the empire's boundless appetite for reinvention. Here, the familiar figure of Jupiter, king of the Roman pantheon, took on a striking new identity. Merged with the Syrian storm god Baal, his bearded face now framed by a crescent moon and a thunderbolt clutched in one hand, a double-headed axe in the other. This wasn't just cultural borrowing, it was divine alchemy, a fusion of traditions that mirrored Rome's own sprawling, patchwork identity. What drew legions of soldiers to this exotic cult? Look no further than the artifacts left behind. Iron votives shaped like weapons, miniature eagles with wings outstretched, and tablets inscribed with vows from centurions stationed at the empire's edges. Jupiter wasn't just a god, he was a battle-hardened patron for men who spent their lives marching into unknown lands. His rituals, steeped in Near Eastern mystery, offered something Roman state religion couldn't: visceral, personal connection. Initiates handled forged iron during ceremonies, a tactile symbol of strength, while the eagle, both Rome's military emblem and sacred bird, bridged the gap between imperial duty and divine favor. The temple's very architecture whispered of distant horizons. Fragments of its decoration reveal Syrian-style motifs, solar discs, storm clouds, even a relief showing the god astride a bull, a nod to his ancient Hittite roots. Yet the building itself was quintessentially Roman, a confident assertion that foreignness could be embraced without threatening the empire's core. For a time, it worked. Emperors like himself of North African descent saw the cult's potential to unify an increasingly diverse military. But by the 3rd century, as Rome's crises, tolerance frayed. The temple's violent destruction during Emperor Thrax's reign wasn't random, it was a calculated strike against the other. As the empire fractured, so too did its religious experiment, yet the fragments tell a deeper story. In museums today, you'll find altars repurposed as Christian, his eagle imagery reborn in church mosaics. Even in ruin, this temple proved a truth Rome often forgot. Gods, like empires, never truly die. They just change form, waiting for the next civilization ready to wield their power. The Temple of Serapis rose along the Tiber like a dream of Alexandria transplanted, its marble columns crowned with lotus capitals, its halls thick with the scent of sacred incense and the whispered prayers of the desperate. This wasn't just another foreign god's shrine, it was a theological revolution in stone. Serapis, that enigmatic fusion of Egyptian Osiris and Greek Zeus, with his flowing beard and grain-measure crown, embodied something Rome had never seen before, a deity designed for export. Ptolemy I had crafted him centuries earlier as a bridge between cultures, but in Rome he became something far more dangerous, a universal answer to every human longing. Step inside and you'd find a sanctuary that categorization. To the left, scholars pored over scrolls in a library said to rival Alexandria's own, their debates echoing off walls painted with celestial maps. To the right, the sick clustered around a statue whose feet were worn smooth by centuries of touch, believing Serapis, gaze alone, could cure blindness or soothe fevers. And at the center, the god himself, seated on a throne, his right hand extended not in judgment but in welcome, a deliberate contrast to Jupiter's thunderbolt. This was religion as one-stop shopping, wisdom for the mind, healing for the body, and the promise of an afterlife so vivid that initiates swore they'd walked through its gardens in dreams. But Serapis' real power lay in his adaptability. Roman soldiers saw him as a comrade, his cult's initiation rites mirroring military oaths. Greek philosophers praised him as the embodiment of logos, divine reason. Egyptian migrants found solace in his Osirian roots, his connection to the Nile's lifeblood. Even early Christians struggled to resist. Clement of Alexandria grudgingly admitted Serapis' wisdom, while others quietly reused his imagery for Christ as the Good Shepherd. That elasticity made him irresistible and ultimately intolerable. The temple's destruction in 391 CE wasn't just vandalism, it was ideological erasure. When Christian mobs toppled Serapis' colossal statue, they weren't merely attacking a pagan idol, they were dismantling the idea that truth could be plural. The library scrolls, used as tinder for public bonfires, symbolized more than lost knowledge. They were proof of a world narrowing. What terrified the new order was Serapis' foreignness, but his familiarity. Here was a god who'd preempted Christianity's best tricks, a resurrection myth, a judgment ritual, even a sacred meal of bread and wine. In a battle for souls, that made him the ultimate rival. Today, all that remains is a single granite column near its surface pitted by time. But the questions Serapis raised still smolder. How much belief can a society tolerate before unity cracks? Can wisdom ever truly be extinguished? The temple's ashes scattered across the Tiber, but its legacy lingers, not just in the medical symbols borrowed by Christian saints or the university systems modeled after its library, but in the haunting realization that some gods refuse to stay buried, even when their temples fall. The Temple of the Claudius stands as one of Rome's greatest ironies, a monument to a man who spent his life being underestimated, only to be in death. Picture the scene: Emperor Claudius, the stuttering scholar mocked by his own family, now immortalized in gleaming marble, his cult statue draped in the robes of Jupiter himself. This wasn't just posthumous flattery, it was political theater at its most audacious. The temple's sprawling complex on the hill, with its artificial lakes and terraced gardens, celebrated Claudius' conquest of Britain, a campaign many senators had dismissed as a farce until the triumphant parade of Celtic chieftains and British gold proved them wrong. Yet even in victory, the joke lingered. The man who'd been called a half-finished Hercules by his mother now had a temple where sacrifices burned in his name. But here's the twist: Rome's elite weren't fooled. The Senate's vote to deify Claudius had less to do with his virtues than with Nero's need for legitimacy. By endorsing his predecessor's divinity, Nero tied himself to a bloodline stretching back to Augustus. The temple's construction became a loyalty test. Wealthy families vied to fund its columns and friezes, their donations buying favor with the new regime. The irony. Claudius, who'd written volumes on Etruscan religion, would have been the first to see through the charade. Ancient sources whisper that he once joked about the absurdity of imperial deification, calling it a fine consolation prize for being poisoned by one's wife. Nero's repurposing of the temple's massive podium for his golden house wasn't just architectural recycling, it was symbolic patricide. As workers stripped Claudius' gilded roof to adorn Nero's pleasure palace, the message was clear. One man's god was another man's quarry. The surviving substructures, later incorporated into the Church of E, tell their own story. Christian builders kept the bones of the pagan temple intact, grafting their basilica onto its skeleton like a moral about hubris. The layers are still visible today: Claudius' brick arches framing medieval frescoes, his imperial ambition repurposed for a new kind of empire. What makes this temple truly fascinating isn't its grandeur, but what it reveals about Rome's elastic definition of divinity. Deification wasn't about sainthood, it was about stability. When the Praetorian Guard declared Claudius emperor, they did so literally dragging him from behind a curtain. By turning him into a god, Rome retroactively dignified that farcical moment, rewriting chaos as destiny. The temple's water features, fed by the aqua, an aqueduct Claudius himself had completed, became a liquid metaphor. Even the most mocked ruler could become the source of life if the empire needed him to be. Standing among the ruins today, you can almost hear the echoes of ancient laughter and whispered deals. The cracks in the masonry aren't just signs of age, they're fractures in the facade of imperial propaganda. Because Claudius' greatest legacy wasn't the temple he never asked for, but the truth it inadvertently revealed. In Rome, divinity was never about who you were. It was about what the living needed you to have been. And that lesson, etched into every repurposed stone, might be the most immortal thing of all. The Temple of the Divine Trajan stands as a paradox carved in marble, a monument so grand it dwarfed the forums around it, built by the very man who spent his reign unraveling its honoree's legacy. Hadrian, the restless intellectual who preferred Athenian sandals to Roman armor, had little in common with his warrior predecessor. Yet there he was, pouring mountains of gold into a temple that would enshrine Trajan's ashes beneath a column taller than 10 stacked chariots. This wasn't just homage, it was high-stakes theater. In Rome, even the most radical reformers knew better than to break the chain of imperial charisma. Look closer at the temple's placement, and the political calculus becomes clear. By tucking Trajan's remains directly beneath the spiral frieze of his Dacian conquests, Hadrian performed a visual rhetoric. Every visitor gazing up at those carved battle scenes would unconsciously link military glory with dynastic continuity, a narrative Hadrian desperately needed, having been adopted by Trajan on his deathbed under murky circumstances. The temple's gleaming white facade, visible from every corner of the forum, became a billboard proclaiming, "The empire endures even if the policies change." But the real genius lay in the temple's symbiotic relationship with Trajan's market next door. While priests burned offerings to the emperor, merchants in the multi-story market complex haggled over Spanish olive oil and Syrian silks. The scent of incense blended with the tang of fish sauce. The clink of coins echoed the chants of Vestals. This wasn't accidental urban planning. It was a deliberate blurring of sacred and secular that defined Roman life. The market's rent payments even funded the temple's upkeep, creating a self-sustaining cycle where commerce literally conquest. Hadrian's subtle rebellions peeked through the cracks. Unlike Trajan's column, which celebrated specific battles, the temple's decorative program was oddly generic. No scenes of the emperor cleaving through barbarian hordes, no piles of Dacian loot. Instead, allegorical figures of victory and peace flanked the entrance, quietly signaling Hadrian's preference for diplomacy over war. Even the choice of architect, rival, whispered of artistic vendettas. The man who'd mocked Hadrian's drafts as pumpkins would never see his designs grace this shrine. What survives today tells a story of layered repurposing. Medieval stonecutters the temple's marble for churches, but they left one haunting fragment, a massive Corinthian capital now displayed upside down near Via, its acanthus leaves forever frozen in a petrified cascade. It's an unintentional metaphor for how Rome treated its own history, constantly flipping the script, reusing the past without fully erasing it. The temple's legacy isn't in its vanished gilded roof, but in the uncomfortable truth it embodies, that even the most genuine tributes can be tools, and every act of remembrance is also, inevitably, an act of rewriting. As we close this exploration of Rome's lost temples, it's clear these sacred spaces were far more than just architectural marvels. They were the living, breathing heart of an empire's identity. Think of them as ancient social media platforms, where every column, altar, and fresco broadcast messages about power, survival, and what it meant to be Roman. The Temple of Saturn wasn't just a bank. It was a physical manifestation of the empire's belief that commerce and spirituality could share sacred ground. The underground weren't merely worship spaces. They were covert networking hubs for soldiers seeking brotherhood beyond the battlefield. What makes these ruins so compelling isn't their grandeur, but their contradictions. The same civilization that built the bloodstained temple have also created the inclusive sanctuary of Diana on the Rome gods of war alongside deities of healing, enshrined emperors as divine while allowing slaves to pin their broken shackles to temple walls. This messy, vibrant spiritual landscape mirrors our own modern complexities, our endless balancing of tradition and progress, unity and individuality. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in how these temples transformed. The Temple of Isis became a blueprint for Christian iconography. The Temple of the Claudius found new life as part of a medieval church. Even in their decline, they refused to disappear completely, instead seeding new traditions like spiritual phoenixes rising from the marble dust. That's the real magic of history. It never truly ends, only reshapes itself. So the next time you walk past a modern building, a courthouse with its imposing columns, a university library with its domed reading room, remember you're seeing echoes of these ancient sacred spaces. The questions the Romans grappled with in their temples still haunt us. Who gets to belong? How do we balance power and compassion? Where do we find meaning when the world feels chaotic? The stones may be silent now, but their legacy whispers in the foundations of our own societies. Now it's your turn. Which temple's story spoke to you most? Was it the merchant's prayers in Riverside Sanctuary, or the Vestals' secret knowledge vanishing into history? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this journey through time, hit that subscribe button to join us as we keep unearthing the extraordinary stories buried in plain sight. Because history isn't just about looking back, it's about understanding who we are today through the lives of those who walked before.